I'll briefly recapitulate aspects of the framing remarks I've provided at previous events, which touch on some of the conversations and debates that this series emerges out of. In recent years, there has been a proliferation of texts that explicitly or implicitly engage with questions about the relationship between climate and religion. Since at least Lynn White Jr. in the 1960s, a range of authors have asked whether Christianity, specifically in its Western and Protestant iterations, might have contributed to attitudes that underpin the climate crisis. In a different vein, others have posited that disenchantment or secularization are responsible for stripping the world of intrinsic meaning and rendering matter inert. The novelist Amitav Ghosh, a previous speaker at IRCPL, points out that the widespread exploitation of fossil fuels began at the moment that Western thought started to imagine humans as distinct from nature, and Western powers began to colonize both land and people to fuel their economic rise. Similarly, the historian Faiza Zakaria notes that colonization not only dispossessed and extracted in a material sense, but also ruptured worlds that encompass spirits, ancestors, and other non-human beings. The Anishinaabe critic Kyle Powys-White points out that for indigenous peoples in the Americas, the climate apocalypse, with its attendant fears of dispossession, forced relocation, and human extinction, came long ago. In his words, quote, "Indigenous peoples already inhabit what our ancestors would have characterized as a dystopian future." As such, colonial forms of violence cross-cut boundaries between material and immaterial, and anti-colonial struggles often involve efforts to reconstitute these webs of connections, as well as to regain sovereignty. Yet for Ghosh, the climate crisis ultimately undoes the mirage that humans in the mold of Western man can unceasingly manipulate inert matter to their will. In his view, growing awareness of the vast scale and complexity of the interconnections that surround us are reattuning people to the vitality of materiality and potentially awakening new religious sensibilities. Ghosh is just one among a wide array of philosophers, social critics, and environmentalists penning climate polemics that percolate with religious idioms, dialects, and sensibilities, bringing with them lines of argument that not long ago would likely have been dismissed as mystical or romantic. For those of us with commitments to the study of religion, then, this moment pushes us to think creatively about how the resources of our field might contribute to these pressing debates. This series picks up on various threads of these intersecting conversations. We work with an expansive understanding of religion that seeks to draw in a wide array of modes of thinking about the cosmos and the place of humans and other beings within it. At the same time, we hope to show that engaging with climate forces a further unsettling of that famously tricky concept, religion, and its intertwinement with multiple ways of knowing, being, seeing, and thinking. In today's conversation, we turn to wildfires in the context of the United States and Bolivia. Fire is a potent symbol of both destruction and regeneration. In the United States, wildfires are perhaps the most visible and menacing spectacles of the climate crisis, not only devastating the lives of those immediately in their path, but also making the air near to unbreathable for millions. Professor Petryna and Professor Winchell work in distinct contexts in the Americas, yet they both engage with the lived experience of wildfires ethnographically to examine how people are working out questions of meaning, survival, and endurance against the backdrop of rapidly changing ecologies. And with that, I'll hand it over to Professor Petryna to introduce her work. Thank you.
Hello, I'm just going to share my screen here. Thank you so much for the invitation, Justine and Raffaella, and thank you to Columbia's Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here with you today. And I thought I'd share a few insights from my recent book, Horizon Work, in which I reflect on what ecologists of various stripes call abrupt ecological change. It refers to things that we already know: intensified storms, droughts, and wildfires that are breaking out of known metrics of frequency and speed and spread. I hope my book contributes to thinking about preparedness in an uncertain present and future, and provides an opportunity to rethink the meanings of collective action. And I'm especially looking forward to being in conversation with Mareike on her work in Bolivia. It happened too fast in regions destroyed by floods in the past years. Here in southern Brazil, from May, rapid shifts in patterns and trends are more than a collection of ecological surprises. They render the very concept of projection ineffectual. In the US and elsewhere, well-defined wildfire seasons are starting to just be called fire years. Several states, like California, have seen first ever wintertime megafires during what should have been the peak of their rainy seasons. Expectations about the environment and how it should act are being undone. In an idealized world, scientific projections hold. Natural disasters can be contained, and knowledge, assumed to be cumulative, can be relied upon to maintain some semblance of predictability. In World 2, nature refuses to submit to that kind of control. The gap between what is predictable and what occurs grows too large. And we fall into a chronic state in which only disastrous surprises emerge. In this world, we can say that projections degrade, circumstances run away from given explanations and models, validating the idea of climate change as a race against time. Within such change, my inquiries took me to two interconnected fields. The first concerns ecological theorists and experimentalists who, over the last few decades, have reckoned with large-scale ecosystem shifts and are attempting to define varieties of critical ecological thresholds that, if crossed, may entail irreversible change, and they're characterizing, if possible, early warning signals for such changes. Such modifications can appear anomalous at first. That wildfire season was long, but stabilize into a new state of organization. Wildfire seasons are getting longer. Their impacts start to be observed at a region-specific scale. That mountain that should be soaked in rain or covered in snow and thus resistant to fire is burning. What leads from one stage to the next, in which the mountain burns in winter, is, in fact, a collection of mist signals. And scientists have come to call these shifts regime shifts, or rapid modifications in ecosystem dynamics, leading to different and sometimes unfathomed states. 20% of the Brazilian Amazon has been deforested since 1970. Logging and rancher-set forest fires burning out of control in changing climate conditions are threatening another 20%. At 40%, the forest can be lost forever, some areas becoming like savanna as drought continues and precipitation decreases. In the US, the question of ecological tipping points took me to a second field of inquiry, where I focused on ground-level actors, frontline emergency workers, who are spending their time going back to the basics of phenomena like fire that they thought they knew. They now find themselves in what one fire researcher simply called the upper limits of bad. In these upper limits, ecological regime shifts test and often overwhelm a paradigm of emergency response predicated on the notion that wildfires are something to be controlled. Here, one can argue that meaningful baselines from which to gauge progress in the fight against fire become fewer and fewer. And now, what seems like a futile race against time, method and circumstance have become misaligned. but rather than resigning themselves to hopelessness here, I tracked community of experts, including climate and wildfire scientists, first-line responders, and indigenous land stewards who are looking for other options. The expansion of this deliberative space of action becomes all the more crucial, or as one wildfire scientist put it to me, we need to acquire a horizon. Strange, as if a horizon were a thing rather than metaphor, a kind of tool to pry time from the onrush of disasters, or as he said, quote, for deciding what we are going to do over the next week, not like the next hour. And he went on to say, but what I really mean is that we need to act in a way that we are not cutting off options for future generations. Options that include the option to mitigate the climate emergency, or the option to act before circumstances for doing so disappear. Here, deeply ingrained illusions of control hinder progress, but my book also shows how certain collective efforts can expand the breadth of resources with which vital course corrections can be made. Such corrections must include a reckoning with ongoing legacies of colonial violence in the US and elsewhere that continue to haunt. The exclusion of fire or fire suppression has been part of the eliminatory work of the settler state. And my work shows how indigenous knowledges through myriad relations inform fire stewardships that, in Candace Callison's words, quote, make stabilization a shared goal, unquote, through practices of resistance, political mobilization, and indeed self-defense. As more carbon dioxide is pumped into the atmosphere, the bigger question is, what would it mean to break from a path of inevitability with our forests, oceans, and lives intact? There are many ways to respond, in ways that do not reproduce the logics of colonial control, and that make fire real in other terms, not just as a quasi-military adversary or as an unstoppable force of nature, but as the stuff of reimagined responses. Beyond the setting of targets of carbon emissions, as urgent as that is, one can look to coordinated acts of stabilization that can halt the move towards ever more intolerable planetary conditions. In other words, to make horizons beyond which the world as we know it disappears is also an exercise in delimiting knowable, more just, and thus livable worlds. Thank you.
Mareike, if you would like to come in now.
Yes, let me just share my screen as well. Okay, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Raffaella for the invitation and to Adriana for the conversation. And I'm just going to jump in the interest of time. So the lowland Bolivian province and region of La Chiquitania, straddling the Amazon and La Plata river basins, has been severely impacted by recent megafires. Megafires act as an extractivist method for deforesting landscapes, facilitating the conversion of land into property and of subsoil, timber, meat, soy, gas, and minerals into international commodities. In ongoing collaborative research, I ask how megafires render landscapes disposable, not only for capital, but also for a set of environmental mediations that can disempower those most afflicted by climate change. In this region, earlier plantation expansion and Jesuit missionary resettlement went hand in hand. associating Indigenous rights and condemning Indigenous rights, including burnt offerings as well as kayapo forms of shamanic fire management, with the devil. This is a narrative given new life in far-right anti-Indigenous politics since 2019. And here I have a few images I'll be dashing through and I could return to. This is against presumptions of a shared atmosphere of harm, the myth of universalism underlying what I call climate affect. Such revelations foreground the unequal harms of an ongoing but not new climate apocalypse. And I have some images, collaborative research. Okay. So my ongoing research explores the conditions that have allowed vast swaths of the Chiquitos region to burn. At the same time, I draw from collaborative fieldwork since February 2020 to examine inter-Indigenous alliances for climate justice that have proliferated in the wake of recent fires. For those targeted by these interventions, megafires and nascent climate mitigation activities reproduce aspects of older histories of territorial displacement by colonial Jesuits, Spanish plantation owners, white and mestizo agrocapitalists, and anti-Indigenous conservationists. Building from collaborative research with the regional Indigenous organization Turubo, as well as with Bolivian firefighters, park rangers, and forestry experts, I ask how these fires act as points of revelation about deeply racialized histories of territorial displacement, land capture, and epistemic violence. In Bolivia, so I'll just go through, here's a photo of collaborative research. Here's emergency aid arriving this past September when I was there. And here is just a glimpse into the ways that languages of sort of Christian rule against Indigenous rights continue to animate national politics in Bolivia. In Bolivia, narratives of fire's obscure emergence and mysterious lines overlook what is for many an open secret. The state's program of agro-industrial progress unfolds through fire as an extractive device, placed in the hands of often desperate newcomers, keen to have access to land and resources. Here, what Bachelard called fire's psychoanalytic complex becomes a political strategy of erasure. By associating fire with unknown origins, primitiveness, and a self-inflicted inferno, state actors in Bolivia seek to wash their hands of responsibility. By moving past a narrative of shared humanity or of a united Bolivian citizenry at risk, we can begin to apprehend the ways that fire is not necessarily random, disorderly, or dispersed in its agencies and contagions, a point that is quite clear in the images of the Chiquitanos fire's orderly rows, which we see here, which indicate sort of the mimicking of the plantation form. Against fire's naturalized opacity, allied engagements with megafires in lowland Bolivia openly name these megafires' causes, not as opaque qualities of elemental combustion, but in legal policies and state institutions that can be named, if not held accountable. These efforts take issue with imaginaries of the Amazon as a place that is disposable, not only for capital, but for carbon sequestration, and where the wildfires arise as a violation of an unspoken pact whereby international aid requires state protection of forests as a global carbon sink. Efforts to stop the Chiquitanos forest from burning enable new forms of discipline, surveillance, and control that seek to make land and people transparent, thereby contravening in an older imaginary of this region, the Amazon as a green hell, that is a space of abiding moral chaos and illegality. So we see here firefighters experimenting and testing out new drones that had just arrived through the government. This was also September, that should be 2024. And here we see an earlier article from 2019 that refers to the Amazon inferno and makes use of this language of chaos. While firefighters at present center their activities on monitoring and putting out fires, they nonetheless integrate new tools like drones and NASA hotspots by which they can track with precision where fires begin and in what Indigenous or campesino communities. Often celebrated as a new suppression tactic, Drones or unmanned aerial devices, SIC, offer tangible evidence of how state fire management regimes and military surveillance technologies can converge. The Bolivian case contributes to broader discussions about how fire remains at the heart of civilizing efforts that yoke burning to backwardsness and make conservation contingent on leaving fire behind. Rural Chiquitos residents arise simultaneously as privileged targets of environmental transformation and as blameworthy victims, in this newspaper article literally referred to as the damned, to be criminalized, tracked, and surveilled through technologies like drones and heat maps. The uneven burdens of these megafires challenge narratives that naturalize harm as an outcome of a shared human history. What alternative stories might be told that reattune analyses to fire's place in these differentiated and differentiating processes of dispossession and struggle? In lowland Bolivia, such alternate stories and sensory archives proliferate as part of what I call fire's revelations, ones which might also offer a methodological tool to scholars who wish to write climate change differently. This is to ask what kinds of anti-colonial climate politics can flourish out of fire's grounding in overlaid histories and cross-cutting alliances, rather than a purified knowledge tradition to be recuperated or defended. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mareike. And thank you also to Adriana for your both incredibly helpful and thorough grounding for this conversation. It's really wonderful to have that rich sense of where you're both writing from. Just a reminder to all the attendees, please do put questions in the chat. I have 4 or 5 questions for both of the speakers to kind of begin the conversation, but then we'll turn to audience questions. So my first question for both of you is that, as I sort of alluded to in my opening comments, that one of the most visible manifestations of climate change, particularly in the United States, but not, also further afield, are wildfires. And they get a kind of spectacular form of coverage in the media as well. So I'm just curious, in what ways does your research sort of deepen or complicate narratives, media narratives around wildfires? And if we go in the same order as before, so Adriana and then Mareike.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're exposed to fire, right? I'm in Rio right now, but even states like New Jersey and New York are places where wildfires are burning, given combination of drought and fast temperature rises in New Jersey, and other human causes that are causing forests and intensive development to become flammable. And, I think in many different places, we've set the stage for disasters that, our present tools aren't really able to manage, especially in communities that are most vulnerable to catastrophic loss. I mean, whole livelihoods subject to catastrophic loss. And I was just with a group of dedicated forest firefighters in the Brazilian Amazon, and a lot of what Mareike said really rings true. They were mobilizing traditional communities living in very remote areas to set up brigades, first response teams that can respond to threats. And of course, the Amazon isn't supposed to burn. It's a humid environment. It's not supposed to burn. But here we are in the second year of drought, which has degraded the forest, made it much more vulnerable and impossible to grow food. I mean, I can tell you about people who are not pulling out their manioc at about month 8 because they can't pull it out in dry soil because it'll ruin the crop for next year. They're waiting for a well-saturated soil, and it's with water, and it's not coming. So, and also during our voyage, our 10-day voyage, there were 3 fires that these brigades were putting out. 2 were pretty major ones. So these are volunteers. They're not contracted workers, where in the US, I think the public's expectation to control fire is pretty high. And when we see these big fires, we think, these are tsunamis of flames that, have no origin, but we have to think about how they are affecting vulnerable communities. We have to think about the people who are being deployed, who our fire control workers are, if there's enough common understanding of these fast changing phenomena for people and agencies to be able to do their work. And even as I found in my work, whether our most basic idea of the body as a reliable sensory instrument is actually up to the task of really adapting and understanding some of these fast changes.
I'll jump in here. Thank you. It's so interesting to be in dialogue across the border from Brazil, which is not very far at all from where I've been working. So yeah, I've been thinking about this question, and I was looking at some of the news coverage, even around the current fires burning in New York right now, like the New York Post article. And I was struck by the ways that these are very much cast as sort of face-offs, nature and human face-off, and nature fights back tends to be sort of the takeaway. And I think that article in particular referred to sort of nature's or the fire's refusal to be contained by these lines, right? That there are these containment lines and that nature's not abiding by those lines, basically. I think that this is interesting because, of course, the idea that nature fights back is also very much central to some versions of sort of the ontological analysis, right? Whereby the non-human comes to sort of come and haunt human designs, right, and complicate human designs. And so I think there's an interesting way in which some of the scholarly work on the elements and popular imaginaries of nature actually are quite close. And I've noticed in presenting this work that audiences are always like, maybe we'll get into this, but very keen to hear, how is fire an agent here? And I'm like, in the work that I'm doing, the people who understand fire as an agent are firefighters, but they're doing so in dialogue with experts, including controlled burning technicians who are traveling from California to give them training sessions, for instance, right? Whereas others are less likely to view fire as this one thing. In Bolivia, what's interesting about the media coverage, and I'll just say this and then I'll stop, is that I think because these mega fires are referred to as incendios, and the word incendio already has incendar, which is to start fire, there's not really this idea of sort of a purified nature, or that these fires are so far afield from human designs or social, economic questions. And so I think what I'm struck by in Bolivia when I speak with people or read the news, there's sort of an acceptance that these fires are also caused by deep inequalities among people, and that even as the government might appeal to this language of sort of we're fighting the fire and we're losing, people on the ground, including firefighters, don't really believe that narrative. So these are really different narratives around nature, humanity, people, resources in the Bolivian and US contexts.
No, thank you both. That's really fascinating. So to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit more towards one of our guiding themes, the question of religion. As again, I kind of began to allude to this, that fire is often associated with a kind of range of, let's say, broadly religious idioms, right? Purification, regeneration, destruction, apocalypse, and is kind of central to like how we even conceptualize apocalypse, right? So I'm curious how in your research you like if and how idioms, like religious idioms, appear in the context that you work in.
Yeah, I think the largely Christian idioms of purification and regeneration were used against indigenous populations to not only give up their fire management practices that were the basis of life, not just to control fire, but these idioms were used to criminalize and even sometimes kill those who are still using these fire practices. And they were part of a symbolic arsenal of settler colonialism. And as we know, involving removal, genocide, erasure, cultural destruction. So the question, as Raffaella, you mentioned, you quoted Kyle Powys White on the question of apocalypse and apocalypse for whom. And as white and other indigenous scholars have made the point that such idioms obscure the anthropogenic catastrophes that have already been visited upon indigenous communities through colonial violence, of which religion and religious imagery is a fundamental part. And so, I think this reckoning with history alongside issues of carbon emissions and hundreds, in the US at least, 100 years of fire suppression is crucial to remaking the idea of fire and actual fire that are now burning out of control. And to my mind, the existential challenges posed by climate change for both anthropology and religion are enormous. So instead of problematic idioms, I like to think about horizons of actionable knowledge for specific communities where chances for future adaptation are not being limited, where capacities for intervention are still viable and not being denied. And along the way, I think that such commitments to time and adaptation and capacity building means that there needs to be some critical realignments of knowledge and power between or across ethical, religious, political, and indigenous spheres.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I've been thinking about this question, and I think there are a range of ways that religious languages shape imaginaries of fire where I'm working in Bolivia, but I would also put forward the provocation that I think Adriana sort of implied, that perhaps, there's not this neat cut. I don't think there is anywhere where there's an engagement with climate change that isn't partly tangled up with ideas of space and history and manifest destiny and for whom the earth is, who should benefit, who is worthy, who is to blame. So I think that these, whether one wants to cite Derrida or Schmidt on this sort of so-called secularizing of political concepts is very much alive in ideas of the planetary. These are ideas that have been mediated through distinct conceptions of the human and privilege. More ethnographically, I think that fire is encountered in a range of ways that for non-Indigenous folks who I've been working with, including sort of far-right evangelicals, there's often a sense of climate change and fires in particular as a sort of test, much in the ways that some communities perceived COVID. So there was a sense that certain subjects could master this form of vulnerability and pass through and even sort of benefit financially, perhaps ritually or religiously, morally from this sort of test. And there's often engagements. Some of this work was conducted during COVID, so I would see people posting biblical verse and sort of being grateful for their own businesses or agricultural farms doing well. Of course, I think among Indigenous folks that I've been working with, there's also a sense that part of this problem has been created through the criminalizing of burning. And what's interesting in the Bolivian case is the criminalization of burning, both legally and historically, coheres environmental questions to religious questions. And part of the lifting on the restriction on burning that Morales did was also, it was related to a sense that landscapes could be made into property, but it was also related to a kind of pushback against evangelical efforts to limit burnt offerings in rituals for saints or for earth beings and other deities. And so, and as we saw briefly in some of the slides I showed, there's been this language of sort of satanic rites on the far right used to define practices of burnt offering through burning through fire that are very common among a range of Indigenous groups in Bolivia. So I think that it's interesting to think about restrictions in legal and bureaucratic engagements with fire, bringing in the question of religion, which of course has been there all along. And then finally, I'll just say that I also see very much some of the resonances with some of Adriana's work here around the ways that both for some firefighters, as well as for some evangelicals who are farming, there is really this moment of reckoning, of sort of an engagement with one's own finitude as a human. And I think that shouldn't be overlooked. It's definitely, and that brings people into also religious imaginaries if they happen to be, Christian, which many of the interlocutors I'm working with are. So I think it's really important to be asking this question, both in spaces that are obviously so-called religious, but also among people like scientists or farmers, who wouldn't be, aren't naturally spaces where social scientists have gone looking for so-called religion.
No, thank you both. And since you both of you began to put the question on the table of the relationship between religion and colonialism and forms of epistemic and physical violence towards Indigenous communities and bodies of knowledge, I thought we might pivot to that question, which is that, especially in the context of North America, there have been calls to revitalize Indigenous land management practices in this moment, which is, both a belated acknowledgement of the role of settler colonialism in the kind of genesis of fires, but also a response to demands by Indigenous communities. So I'm curious, how each of you respond to those calls and conversations in your work.
That's a great question. I think we should remember that fire can have a mind of its own, and I think the idea can be very unsettling for some. I mean, fire goes where it wants to go, where it can burn things, not where people want it to go necessarily. And, like the fire in New Mexico, which I studied, did field research in June, which unfortunately was started by the U.S. Forest Service as a prevention burn. This was the largest fire in New Mexico's state history. But when it got going, the fire did very strange things. Like when it went up a peak, it's the Hermit's Peak fire. The name is Hermit's Peak. People thought it would die out, right? The fire's going up a peak. There's literally a natural barrier. There's nothing left to burn. And what happened instead is it kind of stopped, paused, looked around, explored its surroundings for a while for more oxygen or fuel, which fire needs. And then it just decided to take this improbable nosedive over the summit's 10,000 foot cliff. And as it descended, it turned into a haze of smoke and debris that turned into a 100-foot wall of flame that went down a valley and affected a number of homes and ranches. And so, I've been doing field work in that area, and particularly with people who, some people refused evacuation orders. But one could say that the fire was out of control. But you can also say that the behavior of the fire was out of the realm of communicability with science. So this non-communicability of phenomenon is not something new. My colleagues, Aparecida Velasa and Olga Ulturgasheva, both anthropologists. Aparecida is an Amazonianist. Olga is an indigenous anthropologist, a member of the Iveni people in Siberia, would read this sort of danger of the non-communicable as a sign of a moral breach. We could also read the indigenous one, the Australian writer Alexis White, in her book Praiseworthy, writing about similar things about a mysterious haze and, the moral breach with the non-human. So privileging of relations, the human, the non-human, the more than human, is something that must be safeguarded. And those relations afford communicability with a broader phenomenon. And, so I also did work in Western Montana among the Salish Kootenai. I interviewed fire managers there. And they're doing fire suppression all the time. They're master fire suppressors, but they're also burning land, parts of their land every year in a sense to kind of deoccupy their land of the kind of fire that is haunted by settler colonialism, that would allow them to make their fire practices and fire itself more communicable, more approachable, more manageable. And so these practices were so well entrenched, they so changed the landscapes of what we call now fire adapted landscapes, that the Salish Kootenai actually welcomed the lightning that causes fire. So all this is to say that, you know, we have this issue of revitalization of indigenous knowledge, and that's not to say that we need the resources to fight fire, but this example of the lightning and the welcoming of the lightning shows vividly how how methods of fire management and circumstances can align, and it tells the importance of centering different forms of knowing these phenomenon through through understandings of relations with things that we may not know entirely, but that we have different knowledges from which to learn in order to understand things and to perhaps make them more humanly manageable.
Great, thank you for the question. I think my answer is colored by my experience most recently in early September of this year, in which I had a pre-planned research trip and unwittingly ended up in Bolivia, where there was an emergency order around the fires, and 40%, you know, of the Chiquitos dry forest in the Amazon was burning very close to where we were. And so I'm aware that there are efforts to recover indigenous burning practices in Brazil, in Bolivia, elsewhere in Latin America and in the world. But among the indigenous organization of Chorubo that I've been working with, as well as the firefighters and forestry experts I've been in conversation with, the sheer cost, and this is a question we'll get into, but the sheer bodily effects of these fires, as well as the poison from the firefighting equipment, which was making many children quite sick. So there's no evacuation orders. There's no sense. So people are sort of living in the midst of these massive fires and with that smoke every day. And then also getting very ill from the runoff into water and the polluting of the firefighting efforts. And so this was really a place in which these experiences were overshadowed by a sense of loss. And I think that one narrative that the far right and anti-Indigenous folks have used was to say, oh, you know, these fires are caused by Indigenous people or Indigenous migrants who have lost their traditions of burning. They don't know how to do it right. So the historic practice was chaqueo, sort of slash and burn. And critics will charge that newcomers don't know the seasons. They don't know that you don't want to start the clearing, you know, that June is too early, or that the wind is too strong in the lowland when people are coming from the highland where it's more humid. So there's these languages of inauthenticity, right? Or of accusing people of not being authentically Indigenous, which are yoked to these narratives around the fires and who's causing the fires. At the same time, the people I've spoken with, there is a real reckoning with a sense of loss, that chaqueo and the invocation of traditional burning in many of these places is sort of something that has been misappropriated to defend the use of, you know, fires as a very convenient, cheap clearing device in order to make pasture land. And this was a narrative that I was really resistant to. In fact, until my September trip, I was really resistant to part ways with the insight that actually fire is being used to convert this land into property. I thought it was just sort of part of a far right narrative of racialized blame and so on. But I mean, this is something that folks at the Chorubo organization are saying, and they're saying, we don't want more settlements. We don't want more people coming and getting land through the state program. And so there's a real tension between different Indigenous communities, as well as sort of Indigenous migrants and lowland folks around how to proceed. So in this scene of devastation, in which people were coming and they were sobbing, they were talking about the animals they had found on their ancestral land, welcoming animals, trying to welcome animals into their homes, talking about how the relationships with animals have changed because the animals are more fearful. People are hunting animals they never would have hunted before out of desperation because it's the drought and there's no agriculture. So this was really immensely disturbing. And I know we'll get into this, but there was no talk of the future. And I thought, there was no talk of sort of, if we do this in the future and recover this, then this won't happen. The narrative that I was hearing was only, into the thought of hopefully that it rains. And that was the horizon or the frontier of temporal thought.
No, thank you both. Before I just turn to our next question, I just want to encourage people to put questions in the chat. I have another 2 questions, but yeah, it would be wonderful to bring more voices into this conversation. So given that we've kind of moved to this place of thinking about, these questions of solutions, right? And that's one of the modes that Indigenous land management gets recruited into. I think perhaps for you of all climate researchers, that people are searching for quick fixes or prescriptive answers to wildfires. And I'm curious how you respond to those kind of almost policy type requests. And I think a broader question for anthropologists in general, but yeah.
Well, I did want to respond to Mareike, and so much of what you say resonates with this the silences that people talk about with respect to catastrophic loss, the animals that have left, the animals that return are not the same animals. The trees that return are not the same trees. Brazil has a little bit of a different map in terms of how different land administrations of land work, conservation units, extractivist units, and how indigenous lands sort of relate to those things. But if you look on a satellite, it's always striking to me to see these islands of green, where we see, oh, this is, indigenous territory of the Taquara Munduruku in the national forest, and and it's just a very distinct line. And people are doing the work to maintain these lines, to hold these lines in where they can. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, there are the frontiers of soy expansion. There are the highways with the trucks, the truck drivers throwing cigarette butts out that make grasses burn, that enter into primary forests. There's different kinds of ways of attending to these issues of how do you make the forest stand. But the loss is catastrophic because in so many instances, there's nowhere else to go. There's literally nowhere else to go. And this includes northern New Mexico, where I also do my work, where in the aftermath of the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire, water was threatened. There's severe drought there. There's a system of water channels, ancient system called acequias, that are run by mayordomos, that are actually doing physical labor to recover from fire. So I think the issue of prescriptive answers, one has to really understand how people are left often to their own devices in these burn scars, and they're trying to figure out their futures, let alone how to exist in the day-to-day. In New Mexico, which was a 340,000 acre burn scar. I'm thinking also of somebody like Sandra Guato Silva from the Pantanal. And this is just, because I traveled through the Pantanal a couple years ago with a team of scientists, and it was just so quiet. There were supposed to be birds there that weren't there anymore. And there were a series of catastrophic fires there. And I just wanted to quote Sandra on catastrophic loss when she was interviewed by a newspaper. She said, "It makes me sick. The birds don't sing anymore. I no longer hear the song of the chachalaca bird. Even the jaguar that once scared me is also suffering. That hurts me. I suffer from depression because of this. Now there is a hollow silence. I feel as though our freedom has left us." And so I respond to these, questions around prescription and quick fixes by taking seriously what she means by what she means by the loss of freedom, which essentially is a loss of response capacity, of adaptive capacity. And also my work is about being attentive to the political logics that either cultivate or, remove such freedom. So I would say in the first instance, it's very important to think about this issue of catastrophic loss that Mareike raised.
Great. Yeah. I mean, the question of quick fixes is difficult because I think that as anthropologists, we're often trained to suspend the applied dimension and say, oh, it's more nuanced, oh, it's more complicated. But I think actually we're at a moment, I think, in anthropology where we have to reassess that sort of knee-jerk reaction and say, what is to be done? And I think that, quick fixes can be problematic when they uphold a logic that it's lacking technology, or it's lacking money, or it's lacking knowledge. That if only this, then the fires could be put out. And I think that at least in the place where I'm working, there's a sense, this is the institutional response, that because of a lack of resources, the fires can't be put out. But I think that people operating in the region, in the zone, are aware that there are dramatic human disparities, and disparities in livelihoods and futures that also animate the possibility of turning away from fire in what it can promise as a conversion device, as this sort of disruption. So that's the one way that quick fixes might work on the part of the government. On the other hand, I've been really inspired by conversations with firefighters, including a range of different people who are not firefighters, who are, as Adriana said, creating brigades. They're creating sort of their own firefighting units. The Chorubo organization I'm working with, the vice president, she has now, said they're going to create their own firefighting brigade. They're untrained. So they're accepting donations so that when fires start, because of the slow institutional response, they go and they're fighting fires. I spoke with other firefighters who were wanting to create sort of more informal living arrangements where artisans would work together and do mask carving and sell masks, so they would have a source of income, so they would be in one place so they could quickly respond to fires. And I heard horrific stories of domestic fires breaking out in homes and it taking 6 hours for firefighters to get there, and children being just awful, horrendous stories, right, about this lack of institutional response. So I think that the place where I'm working, the sense is that you do precisely need the quick fix, because it's the temporality, it's not the expansiveness or the scale, it's the time of the burning and the quickness of fire that people are perceiving to be it's the greatest cause of suffering. Mm-hmm.
No, thank you so much. That's really helpful and important. We've kind of, I think, throughout this conversation, there have been threads of, just the kind of the affective and like materially devastating dimensions of wildfire. And I think it makes me wonder, like, as researchers, how do you respond to that, right? Like, how do you like, kind of daily encounters with profound devastation and loss?
I mean, I do sense loss. I sense it, in my encounters, and I'm overwhelmed by people's commitment to care and to recover and push forward. Oftentimes there is that line where it's hard to even imagine, like Mareike said, a future. So, but I also put that in the perspective of, what kinds of, as I mentioned earlier, freedoms are being lost in the process. So I do think about this issue of resources and training, all the things that need to come together in the immediacy of the crisis, which means we can't have, separate discourses. We need these knowledges to come together in a way that can act in the moment. But I think, what can I say? It does affect me a great deal.
Yes, I mean, when I had this moment when I was in Bolivia most recently in September, where I really asked myself, what are you doing here? And it wasn't my intention to sort of be flying into a crisis situation. But I found that in that it really laid bare a set of disparities around the experiences of climate change. And it made me so aware of the privilege of breath in a place like London, and getting out of the tube at King's Cross, arguably like polluted center of the city, and just breathing for the first time in 3 weeks or so air that wasn't severely contaminated by smoke, and how much many of us take that for granted, who have it. So that's sort of the immediate physical response that I had, both of migraines and just being physically affected by the smoke, and then realizing that disparity of sensorial experience. I think the other question for me is really reshifting how I do research and thinking about alternatives to traditional ethnography. And I've been part of my research is around surveying sort of the national situation and these narratives of fire and working with firefighters. Another component is collaborative field work with this organization, in which our sort of terms of engagement were co-written, in which there's a sharing of the research and writing, and in which we're planning to do a documentary film and provide video cameras to people, and also think about what kind of archives can be built from the ground up that might contravene in these narratives, that devalue this space and devalue these communities because they're seen as sort of having been thoroughly mediated by the Jesuit past, and therefore being not as precious as some areas of the Amazon, for instance. So I think that I just taught Max Laboron's work in my methods seminar for our doctoral students last week, but I'm thinking very much about, that as Max Laboron insists, the question of how is the question of ethics. And I think that working in a place where there isn't this privilege of being able to say, oh, this is research and this is what my interlocutors are interested in or concerned with. So allowing for a slippage or a breakdown of those two borders and reimagining what can be possible as an ethnographer.
No, thank you both so much. I'm now going to turn to some of the questions in the chat. And Eleanor raises some questions that we've already sort of begun to allude to, but I thought that there's a part of this question that we might focus on, which is, her question begins, what do you think are the most fundamental misunderstandings about fire and its management in the public sphere? And then she asks, if there was one thing you could say to FEMA, and I was thinking actually maybe we could focus on the next part of her question, which is one thing you might tell to climate change deniers, because I think that's a kind of group that maybe is lurking in the background of this conversation, but we haven't addressed directly yet. So yeah, Adriana.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that my work pushes back on is the idea of the wildland firefighter, at least in the US, as a kind of selfless hero. As they told me, they are not selfless heroes. They are they're tasked with increasingly unrealistic expectations around the control of fire, and which in a sense kind of helps the public turn a blind eye to the actual risks and sacrifices that they make. So I think this is a really important point because in the US, for example, I mean, we can talk about the lack of response or resources in other places, but there was nobody left to recruit to fight the fires in the US. And the mental stress that firefighters face, we have to really think carefully about this line between, who is the savior in our society and who is the victim. And we need to blur those lines a little bit, and we need to take responsibility for the way we think about infrastructure, the way we think about fire as a kind of firefighting as a problematic, culturally adaptive mode. We have to think about the ways in which we can allow local communities to have the resources to protect themselves. And this isn't just in Brazil and Bolivia, but also in the United States. You know, people are also, in some sense, abandoned by big agencies because these fires are growing too complex. So I think that the perspective on denialism is one that will hit us in ways that I don't know exactly how, but it will become potentially dangerous when what we see as citizens before our eyes may be something that we have to deny. So I want to keep pushing the notion that we need to understand these fires, we need to protect the people who are fighting these fires, and we have to take responsibility for the legacy that we've we inherited and that creates these large scale fires. And on top of that, we need to stop carbon emissions that are creating the conditions in which fires burn catastrophically, and we can reverse those conditions.
I don't have as an eloquent a solution, you know, to this question of misunderstandings, but I can identify a few things that I see in my research and that I think crop up both in conversations about the Amazon and Bolivia, but also more globally. One is, I think that, you know, there continues to be, when I tell people that I'm working around questions of fires, I continue to encounter the sort of language of we, oh, we're doomed, oh, we're in trouble, like, oh, climate change, oh, no future. And I think that something that, you know, I've been thinking about in relation to actually the figure of carbon, the carbon mask, the map of carbon leaking, the history of carbon, and thinking also about the history of changing energy usage in the work globally is very much the unequal distributions of sort of possibility and sacrifice, and the ways that certain regions and peoples sort of continue to retain the privilege of imagining a post-carbon future or enacting a post-carbon future. So I'm very much, and while others sort of are charged with mining the materials, right, or being the raw matter for those so-called post-carbon futures. So I've been thinking a lot about energy, about carbon, about flows, and of course there is this question of what is concealed by that map that I showed with the sort of bleeding heart of the Amazon. I think that does a set of, it fixes spatial imaginaries in ways that can actually close down a sense of accountability, or close down a sense of responsibility for those who do not reside, say, in the Amazon. So, I mean, we need to be thinking about gas, natural gas, mining, consumption, meat, soy industries, things that aren't always immediately linked to something like wildfires. And a lot of this expansion hasn't just been the agricultural, you know, the meat industry, it's also been soy. So I think just on a basic Marxist level, there's this question of how do different people live and what are their accountabilities to things that may seem very far away, would be one area of misunderstanding. One other, just more immediately in the place where I've been doing the work, has been around sort of suspicion and misinformation around firefighters. And I'm curious if Adriana's experienced similar things in Brazil, but a sense that because the fires have been so politicized, with the ousting of Morales and with the coup and with a lot of national strife and violence, there's really an uncertainty. People blame firefighters at times. They say certain firefighters are starting the fires. And then I speak with firefighters and they say, no, we were doing counter burning tactics. Like, yes, we started the fire, but it was, you know, to secure, to sort of enclose the fire. This was, and that strategy isn't understood. So then actually people say, oh, it's the firefighters starting the fires for the government, so that they get resources and so they can paint the current, you know, politicians as negligent. So there's a lot of suspicion and doubt and sort of anti-truth or alternate truth circulating here. And at the same time, I think there are cases where people have said, firefighting chiefs came in, and when someone saw them go into a hotel and sleep all night, get up in the morning, put on their stuff and say, oh, we were battling the fire all night. And sort of these narratives about labor, about who can be trusted. I think this is all something that needs to be, I don't have sort of, I can just sort of comment. I see it still in the research. And so I think this questions of truth and doubt and suspicion very much come up, and part of the argument could be that they have to do with the qualities of fire and the erasure, right, of its origins. But I think it's also about the high stakes for debates, national politics of indigeneity, climate change, wildfires. These are key sort of sites that capture these doubts and suspicions and refusals around settler, colonial, and indigenous politics.
Could I just add a little bit to that? Because I think
Absolutely.
that there's absolute resonance in Brazil around accusation. There was a big case in Brazil recently in which a brigade was criminalized for fighting fire, and also accused of starting fire. This was under Bolsonaro, but the particular brigade has evolved and expanded and is an important node for organizing multiple brigades in an area of the Amazon that is temperatures has already risen by 2 degrees Celsius there. And so even as they do their work, they are being accused, even today, by far-right senators. But they have a certain willpower to cut through this, especially because the communities themselves really need the expertise. They need the networking. They need to be able to call, so Jose Martins in Ana, because we have a fire in a little village that isn't, outfitted with a brigade or even somebody who can, respond. So Jay goes to a little community to help them out. And at the same time, he's validating the hotspot, that is seen from the satellite, trying to see what kind of fire this is, what's the scale of it. And so you need human eyes, you need human validators of these fires. But the brigades themselves are really important nodes of education, of environmental education. And so that's something that I think will help mitigate against some of this denialism. But the truth of it is that the realities of fire are really complex, and the fires themselves are becoming more complex in the US. And what I fear is that if we shut down the conversation about what it means to fight fires, the human labor that is involved in fighting fires, the kind of witnessing that has to be done, then we'll end up with kind of an army of fire control workers who are just kind of dispensable, right? Because no one dare talk about these complexities, these human complexities. But I think that's where the anthropologists can step in and keep taking away from this discourse of denialism that very human labor that is involved in witnessing, doing the science, doing the fighting, doing the education, and so forth.
No, thank you both for those rich and provocative answers. The next question is more of a technical question, but I think could be helpful for people coming to this topic fresh, which is that an anonymous attendee has asked, what are examples of Indigenous fire management? I wondered if each or one of you would like to take that question.
You want to go first, Mareike?
I mean, yeah, I can answer, but I mean, from the research that I've been doing in the with Tarubo staff and leaders, and as well as associated communities, in the Chiquitos region in particular, I'm not seeing efforts to reclaim Indigenous fire management per se, but there's an awareness and a dialogue that opened to me about the displacement of Kayapo burning practices, which were not actually about fire management per se, but they were about orientations to land, to more than humans, in a landscape through very precise mechanisms for securing crop regeneration through the use of fire. But they were not understood within the ambit of sort of a more, secular concept of managing fire, for instance. And then the chakeo, which is sort of slash and burn, often is evoked as an indigenous fire management tradition, but at least according to scholars like Susanna Hecht, who's written a lot about the Amazon, this is a practice that really changed since the 1970s as it was absorbed into the expansion of the agricultural frontier and became sort of taken up by agriculturalists in a way that held, they argue in that book anyway, very little resemblance to earlier kayapo burning practices.
I think the practices are varied. I think being attuned to temperature, humidity, wind patterns, taking advantage of those things so that fire is low intensity burn, not high intensity, as we see. And once those burns occur, then next year those areas will be more manageable. And I mean, in the Tapajos, it's not just indigenous, but it's also traditional farmers who are caught in a kind of fire poverty trap, in fact, who use burning to for their land, for their agriculture, to put ash in the soil. I was just with the group of people from the Chico Mendes Institute and these brigades who were talking to these traditional farmers about how to do prescribed burns and when, what time. But sometimes people do them like in a circle. They'll sort of burn in a circle, but that's not the best way under uncertain conditions, because the fire kind of creates its own momentum, right? And it really burns at high temperature in the center. And so some of the animals cannot flee that situation. So, these traditional farmers are very attentive to giving animals a chance to escape. So for example, certain bees can't move at the pace that the fire is moving upward. So burning in an L, where you're burning against the wind in an L, and the fire is kind of moving towards themselves in a diagonal and kind of burn themselves out. But meanwhile, you have the animals that can escape at the same time. So there are different ways in which people are thinking about adjusting fire practices to be more attuned to changing climate.
Thank you both. The next question is from one of my students, and I know that this conversation really chimes with her research interests. So McKenna has said, thank you both so much for your deeply thought-provoking insights. I've been thinking a lot about the work that conceptualizing wildfire as agentive and even fugitive does for disrupting colonial imaginaries in relation to conservation efforts. I'd be curious to hear from you both about how we might simultaneously reckon with both the destructive and regenerative elements of wildfire, and how complexifying wildfire narratives provides new imaginaries of climate-changed futures. So, Mareike, would you like to go first? Or yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is such an interesting question, and I agree that we need to keep in view this question of fire as fugitive, as agentive, and also think about the ways that the political uses and connotations of fire are not new, right? So we haven't really talked here about Black theologies and so on, but of course there is a sense that fire can be redemptive. It can be a source of resistance. And if we look historically at the indigenous rebellions throughout the Andean region, fire has been a really crucial device within mass indigenous opposition to the plantation and hacienda form as a form of racialized labor exploitation and violence. So historically, burning would be, you would burn the estate down, you would burn the animals. Burning was part of a refusal to labor under those conditions. It was part of harnessing the destructive force of fire to undo projects of racial property. At the same time, I think we can also see the ways that fire has been seized upon by opponents and proponents of the state in the last 10 years in Bolivia. Voting booths were torched. Fire was used, and the undecidability of fire's destruction was used as sort of a public condemnation of doubt on the part of the government, whether the electoral process had been fair. So I think these are also ways that fire's qualities fit into longue durée sort of historical political projects that we should think seriously about. I mean, the other side of this question that I'm still thinking about, and I'm hesitant to come down on one side or the other, is, I mean, on viewed from a certain angle, the uses of fire to clear land on the part of deeply impoverished people who have been excluded from sort of the modernizing project in Bolivia is an act of refusal. It's a refusal to abide by the expectations that indigenous orientations to land and nature should be vital, the only sort of vitalistic and fostered growth, and the Amazon and so on. So there's that sense of refusing to be kind of captured by this kind of narrative of what indigenous peoples are or do. And on the other hand, there's this sense that fire's destruction is accompanied by regeneration. And this is, of course, something central to many indigenous burning practices, but it's also something central to far-right agriculturalists' approaches, right? Who also see in these landscapes, oh, look at the crop, look at the shoots emerging just a year after the burn, and sort of contesting the alarmism around climate change that some of these images of the moment of burning generate for publics and for the media and so on. So I'm just looking at the question. Yeah, reckon with both the destructive and regenerative elements of wildfire. I mean, here as elsewhere, I would just insist fire's not one. Even wildfire's not one. There's the incendio, there's a burn, there's a fire as offering. There's a fire as kawa, as a burnt sacrifice. So I think that is something that can quickly kind of fall away when we focus on the element. The element is one part, the elemental qualities of fire is one aspect of this, but it doesn't absolutely define or script the ways that people live and with and do things through fire and different kinds of fire.
I would add that on the issue of the fugitive, what that brought me to was emissions from fire, global fires, fires burning in boreal forests, fires burning in places that aren't supposed to be burning, the precise contribution of wildfires to planetary emissions, and their related degree of warming is not known. There are studies that are kind of starting, but we really don't know how these fires are contributing to emissions. So that's a kind of fugitive aspect of fire that I think makes us have to think twice about our curves, the way we think about the future and various carbon budget scenarios. The second piece on the fugitive, so I continue to do work and think about Ukraine. Fire has been used for the purposes of occupation for millennia. Think about the phosphorus rains in forests in Ukraine that, or the mined forests that firefighters cannot get to, that have to burn. And so there was a first inventory of greenhouse gas emissions from the war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And the contribution, I think one and a few months into the war, was pretty enormous. And a lot of the contribution, in fact, came from forest fires. And so, if this is just one report, I mean, military emissions are undercounted, they're omitted from carbon budgets and emissions reporting requirements. So I think, there's a lot of fugitive going on here with fire that we have to think about very seriously, that does impact our environment, and I'm afraid is also sort of the human aspect of fire.
Oh, thank you both. Given that we have 5 minutes or just under 5 minutes left, and we have one more question left, which seems actually like Kim's question looks like, I think, a really great place to end this conversation. She asks, could you expand on the views of evangelicals on fire, climate, apocalypse? You've spoken about their view that fires are seen as a test of faith, I'm imagining. I'm curious whether the idea that humans have a role to play in bringing on the long-awaited apocalypse. In other words, do they speak of these fires as signs of the end times? And that the Christian obligation is to welcome these signs? Do they draw upon the language of ancient/biblical apocalypse? So yeah, if we go to Mareike and then Adriana.
Yes. So yes and no. There's certainly this sense of fires as a test of faith, and of opportunity, including sort of in the Weberian sense of entrepreneurial opportunity. So who can respond, who can master the changes that are now, as I'm trying to think of Adriana's powerful language, but as the anomaly becomes the structure, who is it who can jump ahead and build that into their design with economic gains has been something that I think I've seen on the part of some evangelical far-right farmers who aren't even really talking about climate change. They're encountering the fires as a much more specific sort of challenge, and then drawing from their own faith and their resources in efforts to sort of do good works, but also in that regard build their businesses and profit from anticipating the recurrent nature of these wildfires. I know that there are many people take environmental disasters as symptoms of the end times. I've seen this narrative more common, also in the far right in the US, around certain things like COVID or sort of post-truth, but also in parts of the Andes in regard to, for instance, the Coyariti glacier in Cusco, in the ways that indigenous shamans understand the melting of this glacier, the loss of this glacier, through a language of blame, of moral blame, of people not being devout enough, of failing. So I think that, and Guillermo Salas, Carreño Salas has written beautifully about this, but I think that the risk with some of that is that these languages of blame and self-blame reproduce these structures of inequality and of racial inequality in ways that as social scientists, we also need to be very attuned to.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add on that because I don't study evangelicals, but I would just say that cosmologies of fire hit communities of color the most. I mean, in the US, this is clear. And it's hitting food supply chains in different kinds of ways. I think this reckoning with cosmology and fire will continue. And I think it really, from our conversation, I've learned that it's really at the moral center of the future of how we think about climate change, and whether or not we can balance those religious narratives with the legacies that we've inherited of colonialism, with the science, which is very important. We talk about tipping points and the end times and apocalypse. Again, apocalypse for whom and who's living after the tipping points? What is the ways in which people know how to live and survive and flourish in those post-tipping point moments? And I think basic science needs to be reinforced in this moment when extreme forms of denialism are afoot.
Thank you both. Before we wrap up, I'm just going to say that our last event in this series is on the theme of air, and it will be on February 6th. It's Sophie Chow from the University of Sydney and Nikita Simpson from SOAS. And that if you're interested in future IRCPL events, I think the link to subscribe to our newsletter is in the chat. But mostly I just want to say thank you both so much, Adriana and Mareike. This has been an incredibly rich conversation, and the recording will be on our website. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.